Joining us now is Glenn Greenwald, former constitutional lawyer and contributing writer and blogger to Salon.com, along with David Riffkin, former Justice Department official with the Regan administration. Thank you for being here. We're talking about the new warrantless wiretapping law. Mr. Greenwald, what changes were made, and why, in your opinion, were they necessary?
Well, I think they're not only unnecessary, but actually quite dangerous. And you know, the reason why I think they're dangerous is the underlying point here is and always has been that nobody is opposed to eavesdropping on terrorists and Al-Qaeda. Everybody wants strong and aggressive eavesdropping. That is not what this debate is about. The debate is about whether the president ought to be able to eavesdrop on the conversations of American citizens and read our emails in complete secrecy without any oversight whatsoever, so that nobody will know if that power is being abused, or whether he ought to be able to eavesdrop and engage in surveillance and read emails only with the oversight of a court in order to prevent the abuse that for decades the American government engaged in when it was able to eavesdrop in secret. What this law does is it gives the President of the United States, not just this one, but subsequent ones as well, the power to read our emails and listen in on all of our conversations that occur internationally from the United States outside of the country without a warrant of any kind, without judicial oversight of any kind, without the approval of a court. And that is exactly the kind of abuse that led to the enactment of FISA in 1978 that said we want the president to eavesdrop and engage in surveillance, but only with the oversight of a court because of all the abuse. That is what this law has gutted. It has given the president vast new surveillance powers with no oversight whatsoever.
Mr. Riffkin, Mr. Greenwald says all conversations can be listened to in emails. Is that true?
It's not true at all. As a matter of fact, what this very modest fix to FISA does, it restores the balance originally reflected in the 1978 Act. The 1978 Act devised the system whereby communications where a United States person is a target, which is primarily in the context of communications within the United States, but also communications overseas if a U.S. person is a target, are driven by a warrant-triggered system. Communications involving foreign persons, and there's individuals who do not reside in the United States, who never set foot in the United States, who have no relationship of any kind in the United States, who do not deserve any constitutional protections or certainly do not deserve any statutory protections that are rooted in our constitutional values. These individuals have always been surveilled warrantlessly. The way it worked for decades is technically, prior to advent of fiber optics, these communications were intercepted by NSA using the satellites over the air. So if you had proverbial North Korean general, a Russian KGB general, or a terrorist sitting in Peshawar, and he communicated with another terrorist or another general overseas, or communicated, it's very important, the United States, and the communication was intercepted overseas. Those surveillance intercepts were never, ever driven by warrant. What has changed? Let's set aside the war and the fact we need intelligence far more now than ever before. What changed is technology. Instead of those conversations taking place over the air, being intercepted somewhere over the ocean by an NSA satellite, because the United States has the best fiber optic systems, most of those communications flow for that system. So now, all of a sudden, and this has really been a gradual change over the last several years, these communications are intercepted in the United States. Same expectation of privacy. My simple question to my colleague is this. If conversation involving proverbial Abdullah terrorist 10 years ago, using NSA satellite over the air, calling you in the United States, were intercepted by the warrant, and they were. Why should it be any different now when the same conversation flows over the fiber optics network and U.S. service? Expectations of privacy are not the same. This is not about U.S. citizens. U.S. citizens are not the targets of his conversations. Foreign persons are. The problem, frankly, for critics, let's be honest, I don't know if you're in that category, but a lot of people are debated about it, really do not care if you're foreign or not. They want to extend the same constitutional protections, the same expectations of privacy that flow out of a constitutional compact to foreigners. And that's just nonsense. If you put it this way honestly to the American people, you would get a resounding no.
So there's a big question mark here. Is it foreign to foreign phone calls? And what we're talking about is a technical issue, that is, those phone calls are routed through U.S. networks, or does it also involve a call from Indianapolis to London?
it would not involve call from Indianapolis. The way it would work, a big chunk of it is purely foreign-to-foreign conversations. By the way, I think all of us agree that it's insane to have a person in Kabul talking to a person in Baghdad and have that be driven by warrant. But there are instances where, again, the target of surveillance is a foreign person who happens to be communicating with somebody in the United States. Look, it is fundamentally no different than having a criminal law enforcement warrant, so-called Title-free warrant. You're a mafia don. You happen to be calling your tailor. Your tailor is absolutely innocent. But just because you're calling your tailor, to the extent that you have a target of surveillance as a mafia don, that conversation would not be tuned out. Your tailor's expectations of privacy may be violated, but these are the breaks. You're not going to have to go and get a new warrant if you have the FBI just because a mafia don is calling the tailor or his grocer.
Can I answer that?
You can. Let me just promote the phones real quick because we want to get our viewers involved in this conversation. Republicans 202-737-0001, Democrats 202-737-0002, Independents 202-628-0205. Go ahead.
What has been going on in this country for the last 6 years is that defenders of greater and greater government power do one of two things to justify that power. Number one is they try and exploit the fear of Americans by ratcheting up the talk of terrorism and saying that unless you give the power to the government, you will be killed by terrorists. The second thing they do is they mislead American people about what has been going on. That's true with Iraq, it's true with torture, and it's true with the answer that he just gave about what this law does. You asked him, does this law enable simply foreign-to-foreign calls to be eavesdropped on, or if you're calling from Indianapolis to London, can they listen in, or if you're emailing a friend in England, can they read your emails without a warrant? And he basically ignored your question and said, oh, it's mostly foreign-to-foreign. Everybody agrees that foreign-to-foreign calls do not need a warrant. The Democrats were willing to change FISA so that no warrants were required. That is not what this debate is about. Pakistan to Afghanistan, no warrants. What this law does is say that every single international communication, emails from Indianapolis to London, phone calls from Miami to France, those conversations, those emails can now be listened in by George Bush and the National Security Agency with nobody knowing what they're doing, with no warrant required, with no judicial oversight. That is exactly the situation that for decades has led to abuses, and it is fundamentally contrary to the entire system of government that the founders created, which is we do not trust government leaders with vast and awesome power to be exercised in secret. We have a system of checks and balances, and we only trust our government leaders to eavesdrop on us and to engage in surveillance with oversight. This law gives vast powers to listen in on our conversations and read our emails with no connection to terrorism, with no proof that anyone has ever done anything wrong. And it is an extremely dangerous situation, and it is vast and overwhelming.
Let's get a phone call in here. Dallas, Republican line, your first phone call. Good morning.
Good morning. I don't know whether people are afraid to tell you the truth because they can't reveal secrets, but there's a program that was enacted under Clinton that does everything that we're talking about. It's called Echelon. That's open source and that's public, so you guys can talk about that, but that's all we've been talking about this whole debate the last few years. The question is, NSA records every international conversation, every single one, and they also hear every domestic call that goes over wires and wireless. They're all recorded. Now, either the Democrats are just playing partisan games and we're reinstituting an old program that dates back to Clinton, or we're now listening to Americans' conversations and recording all those too. Y'all can't tell us the truth because you'd be exposing secrets. The media doesn't know what the heck's been said in open source, so they won't even tell us about Echelon, which is an old program. I don't know whether this is partisan games or whether this program has taken vast new sweeping intrusions into our personal security of American citizens. Probably all American international calls were recorded previously.
Let's get a response from both of our guests. Is this a reinstatement of an old law?
No, and the reason is even the Bush administration admits that ever since 1978 when FISA was enacted, it is the only administration to eavesdrop on the telephone calls of Americans without warrants in violation of that law. But the caller does raise one critical point, which is what has been going on under the Bush presidency has been done behind a virtually impenetrable wall of secrecy. James Comey was here at the Capitol 2 months ago, and he said that what he and John Ashcroft discovered in 2004 that the government was doing was so patently illegal, so unconscionable, that he and Director Mueller of the FBI and John Ashcroft all agreed that if this behavior didn't cease immediately, that they were going to resign from the Bush government en masse. We do not know what those activities are that prompted such an extraordinary reaction on the part of high-level Bush lawyers at the Department of Justice. We don't know most of what has been going on in terms of how this government has been spying on us. The Congress has no idea, in fact, what they just passed in terms of the power that it gives, and I think the caller is right. Most of our government now operates behind a wall of secrecy, and that is an extraordinary problem for a democracy.
Scaremongering is not a useful way, with all due respect, to wage a debate. Almost everything you say with due respect is untrue. As to secrecy, the Bush administration, from the very beginning, after it adopted terrorist surveillance program in the aftermath of September 11, briefed that program to the sole Gang of Eight. So members of Congress, Republican and Democrats in both Senate and House Intelligence Committees and the House and Senate leaderships were involved in that. That's a fact. There's no dispute about it. Point number one. With regard to a new law, as you well know, it brings the FISA court more into foreign intercepts than ever before. Only purely foreign-to-foreign conversations are exempt from judicial review. We now have in place, and again, to answer your question very precisely, in a situation where somebody is calling from Indianapolis, let's say Peshawar, Pakistan, you would not be the one target of surveillance. Your phone number, your voicemail, your email would not trigger any surveillance regime. If the person you're calling and communicating in is a foreign terrorist or enrolled in a program for some reason, the surveillance, the call would be caught because of that. But that, as I've mentioned, I've not heard you rebut it, has always been the case. In 1979, in 1980, if you had a foreign individual calling the United States, if you look at the language of FISA, and the call was intercepted overseas, because as a matter of technology, that's how it worked, because it was before fiber optics. Those calls were transmitted over the air. NSA satellites would have intercepted that call without any warrant whatsoever. We're talking about, we should be having a real serious debate about how to balance privacy with security, not government security, security of American citizens. We're not talking about balancing privacy versus some alien interest of somebody from Mars. We're talking about our interest in being alive. And that's not a joke. That's not an idle threat. We've lost 3,000 Americans on September 11, and God forbid we're going to lose a lot more if we're blind and deaf. We should have a serious debate about it instead of engaging in scaremongering to say that privacy. But look, let's be honest. There is a privacy interest even in that kind of foreign intercept. But it's a lot less, a lot different than in the situation where a target is an American person. And we should be honest about distinguishing those two situations instead of just repeating like a mantra, privacy interest, as if it trumps everything. You cannot lead a day in modern society. You cannot live without sacrificing some privacy in a commercial context, in the context of interacting with your government. We have to be reasonable about it. We have zero effort at serious debate. All we have sloganeering and bashing the Bush administration. And that's unfortunate.
District Heights, Maryland, you're our next phone call.
Good morning. I disagree with this law completely. We don't know what the Bush administration has been done. They tell so many lies. Can anybody believe anything that anyone in this administration, including Gonzalez, would say? I watch the History Channel a lot, and we are becoming the American Third Reich. How Hitler developed the Third Reich through fear and intimidation and lies. And this administration is the worst administration. I'm 70 years, worst administration in my lifetime. George Bush has broken every law in this country. He violated the Constitution. He violated the privacy of American citizens. He's broken international law. The Geneva Convention. He's tortured. He's lied, and I wouldn't believe a word out of that man's mouth.
Okay, caller, we got your point. Mr. Riffkin, has the Bush administration done an adequate job communicating to the American people the need for programs like this one?
Look, it's hard to reach soaring heights of Churchillian oratory in any administration. I would say the Bush administration has done an adequate job. Not a perfect job, but not a bad job communicating what's at stake. The difficulty we have is there's unfortunately such level of partisanship, such level of polarization, and such level of media hostility that it's just you get drowned out. I mean, I don't even know what to tell a caller who starts from proposition that we live in something resembling a Third Reich and Bush is number Hitler. It's hard to have a serious debate. I don't remember, I mean, sure, there's a lot of hostility during the Clinton administration, but it's not useful, okay? We have vigorous oversight system. We have vigorous involvement by Congress in all their issues. We have media that leaks, frankly, you know, I mean, there's no secret that survives. I call it bureaucratic checks and balances. There's no secret that survives more than a couple of years in this administration or any other administration. So any notion that there's a serious levels of wrongdoing, you know, IRS audits for Alan Nixon for partisan advantage or Watergate stuff. It's just nonsense. But that's the impression people have, and it provides a difficult context which have serious debate.
Mr. Greenwald, your response?
I mean, he could say that it's hard to have a serious debate when a caller says we don't trust the Bush administration, but the fact of the matter is this country has seen the Bush administration over the last 6 years, and polls show overwhelmingly that the American people do not trust George Bush, do not believe that the things he says is the truth, and that begins with the Iraq War and goes forward. And I think what's critical to acknowledge here is Mr. Riffkin is a lawyer who almost always defends the Bush administration. I'm a critic of the Bush administration. But look at what the Bush administration's own lawyers in the Justice Department said. These are right-wing lawyers, John Ashcroft, James Comey. They said that the Bush administration, in the way they were spying on us, was breaking the law to such an extreme degree that they were all going to quit unless it stopped. Believe them. Or believe the only 2 federal judges in this country who have opined on what the administration is doing, who have both concluded emphatically that the administration was violating the law. FISA is a criminal law, that George Bush was breaking the law in the way that he has been spying on us over the last 4 years. These are indisputable facts that underlie this entire debate. This country does not trust George Bush, and therefore we shouldn't trust any political leaders to spy on us in secret. And that's the balance that we need. We want them to engage in eavesdropping, but only with judicial oversight.
We're talking about the new warrantless wiretapping law with Glenn Greenwald and David Riffkin. Berlin, New Mexico, Republican line.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning, sir.
I don't understand what a big problem it is. If you're not doing anything wrong or you know, why is it such a big deal? I mean, it's there to protect us, not to hurt us.
Well, the founders of this country understood that if the government is able to break into our homes anytime they want or read all of our letters, that we basically would live in a position of tyranny. And they rejected the idea that the government should be able to intrude into the lives of people who are doing nothing wrong. That is the totalitarian image. That's how people in Venezuela live, or in Saudi Arabia, or in Egypt, where the government listens in and monitors what you're doing. Privacy is a fundamental value in the American constitutional culture, and it's true that it has to give way sometimes to concerns about security, and it has given way greatly. But we do not want to be a society where we simply say to the government, please know everything that we are doing, read all of our emails, listen to all of our phone calls. Whether you're doing something wrong or not, that is a vast power to give to the government, and the proof of that is that under Nixon and even Kennedy and Johnson, they used that power against political opponents. They tried to blackmail Martin Luther King by invading his personal life and finding out what he was doing. That is an extraordinary power to want to give to the government, and people who say, oh, let's just turn over to the government all of our privacy and trust that they will use it well, are people who are describing a system of government that is not the United States.
This new law would expire in 6 months. What does that mean for the capability of the government to get up and running and do some surveillance on suspected terrorists?
It's an unfortunate aspect. We're going to have another debate when Congress comes back. The fact that we do not know what will be the regime governing the intercepts makes it more difficult. You're absolutely right for the intelligence community to operate. But let me be clear again, with all due respect, Glenn, it's not useful to speculate or posit that we're talking about interception of all communications. Nobody's suggesting that. That is not a serious proposition. And incidentally, you can't have it both ways. We have a tyrannical administration that's marching in lockstep, threatening our liberty, or if you look at people like Comey and Ashcroft, who, by the way, Ashcroft was pilloried widely by the left as was Attorney General, engaging in spirit. The fact that we have people engaging in spirited debate in the administration.
They're gone now. They're out. But
you have no idea whether a same debate have occurred. I can tell you, I spent 9 years in the government in 2 administrations, in Reagan and Bush 41. The fact that they have people on the inside engaging in spirited debate honest civil servant and public-minded officials about some policy issue does not mean there's a horrible wrongdoing here and there's angelic behavior there. This is the bureaucratic checks and balances that add on to protect our liberty to role of judiciary, role of Congress. That is not the case. Look, there are many circumstances where American citizens are being searched without any warrant. And the Constitution doesn't require a warrant. The Constitution requires a Fourth Amendment that searches be reasonable. When you drive, and get stopped at a sobriety checkpoint around Christmas, when you come back from Mexico or Canada and you get strip searched at the airport without any warrant, when your kid has his locker searched in school, there are many circumstances, so-called special need cases, where the government can reasonably search you. And if any fruits of criminal activity are obtained, can prosecute you criminally. So the notion that, frankly, Glenn, that people are propounding, including you, that if you don't have a warrant, but it's somehow tyranny, is absurd. That is not how things work.
Kansas City, Missouri, independent line. Good morning. Kansas City, you with us?
Hello?
You're on the air.
Yeah, I'm sick of everybody using the argument that if I'm not doing something wrong, then why would it be a problem if the government is spying on us? But that's not what it's about. It's about the president's shift to a tyrannical dictatorship. The NSA needs to present a document saying that somebody is doing something wrong, or at least they think so, to a judge, and he needs to confirm this in order to wiretap them. Otherwise, it's illegal, and no debate about it. It's just completely illegal, and I have nothing more to say about that. I mean, I can't make it any more clear.
Mr. Riffkin, do you think that there should be some checks and balances with this new wiretapping law?
We do, of course. We do. As a matter of fact, we have more, quote-unquote, checks and balances. We now have the large tranche of foreign targets. Again, these are people who are not Americans, who have never come here. They can be North Koreans, they can be Chinese, they can be Russians, they can be Pakistani, etc., etc. When these people come into contact with the United States, they would be, instead of being surveilled against entirely warrantlessly, entirely driven by the procedures developed in the executive branch, they're going to have a FISA court review those procedures and issue an order either confirming them or suggesting they be modified, and eventually gets appealed to the Supreme Court. That is the greater involvement by the courts than ever before.
But Walter Pincus writes in today's Washington Post, the Bush administration plans to leave oversight of its expanded foreign eavesdropping program to the same government officials who supervise the surveillance activities and to the intelligence personnel who carry them out.
But that's, of course, but that's what their jobs are. If you look at the original FISA, Greta, the Attorney General is the key player. You may like or dislike Alberto Gonzales, but let's look beyond Alberto Gonzales. This is the job of the Attorney General. Mike McConnell, the Director of National Intelligence, is a highly respected professional. Who would you like to do this job? The Secretary of Agriculture? I mean, Secretary of Commerce? This is their job. You have people signing affidavits attesting to the truthfulness of the particular procedures that are being used to enroll people in this program. You're going to have FISA court review it. I mean, the notion that, frankly, the caller is suggesting that you have to have a specific warrant for everything, first of all, is factually untrue. I would suggest to this person that you stop driving drunk at a sobriety checkpoint. He tries to suppress the evidence because he was warrantless. He's going to go to jail. I suggest that if an individual returns home from Mexico and is carrying, some goods he did not declare, and he tries to suppress this evidence, he would lose in a lawsuit with the Treasury Department. He doesn't understand how the system works. The problem with individual warrants, you cannot get warrants fast enough of thousands and thousands of foreigners who are enrolled in this program. And why would you want to get warrants against people who are not Americans?
Mr. Greenwald?
Let me just address that. He said, I think the key here is Alberto Gonzales is the key person, and that's absolutely right. And the question that Americans need to answer is, okay, we begin with the premise the president is going to have the power to eavesdrop on the conversations of people in order to detect terrorist plots. We all agree on that. Now the question is, do you want George Bush reading and Alberto Gonzales deciding which emails they're reading through, which telephone calls they're listening to in complete secrecy with nobody knowing what they're doing and having to approve what they're doing? Or do you think they ought to only have a layer of judicial oversight to make sure that they're really using those powers, those vast and awesome powers, to read our emails and listen to our telephone conversations for proper purposes? He says, Mr. Riffkin says, scaremongering is not something we should be doing. And then you notice in every answer he says, this is necessary because of 9/11, and don't worry, it's only those foreigners whose calls we're going to be listening on. That is absolutely false. Technology now allows all telephone calls to be routed through the same switchers. So the government can monitor every single phone call that London is making to you in Washington, D.C., to any of the viewers at home, and they can decide every single one of these calls involves a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil. They can listen in on every single international call that you make or receive, and every email that you write, and every email that you receive, in complete and total secrecy. And I think Americans know the difference between submitting to a search of their shoes before they get on an airplane and allowing George Bush and Alberto Gonzales to listen to everything we're saying and writing with no oversight whatsoever. They understand that difference.
Can I just say 10 seconds? Quick. This is you, Glenn. George Bush and Alberto Gonzales do not choose the targets of surveillance, do not listen to conversations. Let's be honest. You have career, honorable men and women at the NSA who choose the targets of surveillance using the best judgment. And let's not...
Who do they report to? Who's their boss?
They report to a director of NSA, to the Director of National Intelligence. But the notion that you're trying to evoke for the listeners here, that it would be George Bush sitting in late at night, or Alberto Gonzales choosing targets and listening to conversations, is absurd. They do nothing of the kind. Neither this Attorney General nor any other Attorney General.
Real quickly, what are the implications if they do overstep the law, and that they do listen into conversations of U.S. citizens that are not suspected terrorists? Is there any punishment? Is there
we're talking about people executing affidavits under the penalty of perjury. We're talking elaborate reporting to Congress, including reporting of any violations. We're talking about whistleblowers. Look, this government fundamentally is incapable of engaging in an Nixonian conduct or conduct of time of LBJ or even FDR. We're just incapable of doing it. We're incapable. Look, the worst thing that has happened so far, been reported, it's some incompetence and some sloppiness at the FBI who got the so-called national security letters. There's not been one instance of any political enemy being audited, of Cindy Shaheen being surveilled.
Because we don't know what they've done. And you admit that this law does not, in order for them to listen in, you admit, don't you, that this new law does not require them to say that the person they're listening in on has anything to do with terrorism. That requirement has been eliminated in this new law. You admit that, right?
This new law only deals with foreign targets.
But there's no requirement that it be connected to terrorism. Will you acknowledge that?
Of course.
There's no requirement at all that has anything to do with terrorism.
That is correct. So it can be a drug or arms smuggling, North Korean general.
Or an innocent person.
Yes. Let's operate on the assumption that honorable career people at the NSA are so not busy pursuing real threats that they're interested in listening to the conversation of innocent foreigners. Foreigners, by the way, if you want to listen to conversation of Americans, you need to get a warrant from a FISA court, as it's always been.
Okay, we'll leave it there and go back to phone calls. Little Rock, Arkansas, Republican line. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. Mr. Riffkin, thank you so much for speaking. Mr. Greenwald, thank you so much for speaking. Mr. Riffkin, every example that you've used for the, let's say you're doing something illegal and you have the authorities have reasonable suspicion to pull you over, you're speaking about a car. I think what most people are concerned about, and I know what I'm concerned about, is you coming into my home. You've got no right coming into my home unless a judge deems it necessary. I think it is constitutional that you don't have the right to seize and to search illegally. And I do think that this is, it's a law now, but I do think that this is illegal and unconstitutional. I think that you need to go through a judge. You need that check and balance, which has always been the way that we've done it. I think it was Benjamin Franklin who said that the man that would give up essential freedom for security deserves neither freedom nor security. And I agree with that totally. You've got no right coming into my home unless a judge thinks that it's necessary.
Mr. Riffkin?
A couple of things, hopefully, to reassure you. First of all, we are talking about judicial involvement in this effort. I've said it now 4 times. The only difference is that instead of having a specific warrant, you would have the FISA court, the very same judges, and eventually may well be appealed to the Supreme Court, approving the particular structure, the particular rules. So it would not be done on a say-so of Alberto Gonzales or Mike McConnell. Point number 1. Point number two, nobody's talking about coming to your house. We're talking about situations where the target of surveillance is a foreigner who happens to come into some contact with the United States in a form of a phone call. But let me just posit to you a very simple proposition. I don't know how you feel about your privacy. If I am pulled out of my car and told to walk, the yellow line and touch my nose, or if I'm strip searched crossing the border, I think that is a far more fundamental intrusion of my privacy than somebody intercepting a phone call where I may be a secondary player. I just don't understand the argument that it is, or if my kid in high school gets his locker searched or gets strip searched, and those things have been upheld without any warrant, without, by the way, any reasonable, you use the word reasonable suspicion. It's not a question of reasonable suspicion. There's no need for particularized suspicion. These types of searches have been upheld because the government has a general interest in preventing certain bad things from happening. I don't understand why is it palatable to be strip searched when you cross back in the United States, but it's not palatable to have your phone call intercepted.
We're talking with Glenn Greenwald. He's a former constitutional lawyer and a contributing writer to Salon.com, and also the author of this book, A Tragic Legacy, How a Good versus Evil Mentality Destroyed the Bush Presidency. And our other guest is David Riffkin, former Justice Department official with the Reagan administration. How many years did you spend in the government?
9 years, Reagan 2 and Reagan 1, Reagan 2, and Bush 41.
And did you deal solely with these issues that we're talking about?
I dealt a lot with national security issues. Let me also tell you, I have seen people of remarkable talent in the government. I've seen people who are less talented. I've never seen any sinister individual that sort of fits in this caricature of people just dying. The best government officials cared about doing public good. The worst cared about their pension and working very hard. I've never seen any sinister figure trying to, invade our civil liberty for kicks. It's just not real.
Can I just address that briefly? In the Reagan administration, of course, there were numerous high officials who were convicted of crimes for violating the law. But beyond the Reagan administration, Mr. Riffkin is saying, oh, don't worry, these are NSA professionals. They won't do anything wrong if you let them eavesdrop on us in secret. We have a law in place in 1978, FISA, which resulted because once the abuses of the Nixon administration became known, Congress investigated how these eavesdropping powers were being used. And every administration, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and then culminating with Richard Nixon, abused these powers for improper means. That is what government officials do when you give them power. That is what the Founding Fathers recognized. We do not trust political leaders in the United States to exercise vast powers without checks, because every time they will abuse it, and that is what history proves.
Cocoa, Florida, Republican line.
Good morning. It's not coming into the home. It's going out of the home. For one thing, they're not coming into your home. You're putting stuff out of the home. And this new bill was passed by Democrats. But they don't want illegal aliens to be caught or stuff paid for. I have a question for both gentlemen. First, the one on the left. If this is an illegal thing done by President Bush, the 10 congressmen and senators, including Senator Daschle, Senator Harry Reid, and Nancy Pelosi, aren't they co-conspirators? And for Mr. Riffkin, just like I said, they want to control the airwaves for radio, but when it comes to catching terrorism coming out of homes or going into homes from abroad, they want that to be stopped. I've never made a phone call overseas, and I've never got one in except for business, probably. So I don't understand it. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Greenwald.
Well, the idea that they've consulted with Democrats, Jay Rockefeller has made clear, as has Tom Daschle and many others, that they were told the broadest sketches of what it was the government was doing, and they demanded more information that Dick Cheney ignored. But the fact that Democrats were told that George Bush was breaking the law and they didn't act aggressively enough doesn't change the fact that the behavior was illegal. And again, I don't want anyone to take my word for it. Again, the two judges who have looked at this conduct have said it was illegal, and I would ask Mr. Riffkin, why it wasn't that James Comey and John Ashcroft in the Department of Justice said, oh, well, there's a little disagreement here that we have. They told George Bush, what you're doing is breaking the law. He ordered it to continue anyway, and that's when they said, if you continue to do this, what you've been doing for the last 3 years, we are all going to quit en masse. And only then did he stop, because it was months before the election and couldn't abide a scandal that way. So I think we ought to look at what the Bush DOJ lawyers have said and what the federal courts have said, and they have said that George Bush has broken the law repeatedly and how he has spied on us.
We don't have time to get into this, but with all due respect, Glenn, you're painting with a broad brush. We had the terrorist surveillance program but came into existence shortly after September 11. It continued in 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004. It was reauthorized every 45 days by the officials at the Justice Department, including Office of Legal Counsel and approved by the Attorney General. One, John Ashcroft. For whatever reason, I've actually written speculating into what might have happened. One particular aspect of his program, then you had a new head of Office of Legal Counsel who came in, who took the position that differed a bit in one respect from the previous head. A spirited debate ensued. The way it works, it's supposed to work. I would be, if I were you, reassured by that, okay, that people within this administration, as any other administrations, debate those issues. They worked it out. There's no illegality prior to
But they all got replaced because they objected.
I think we've adequately addressed this aspect of the debate. Washington, Democrats line, you're next. Washington?
Hi.
Go ahead.
My name is Cassandra Richardson. I was kind of hostile, but I'm going to try and calm myself down right now. And I noticed that the brothers are there. We all are brothers and sisters, no matter what color you are. And now my question is, with the authorities' interception, and you're saying that it's President Bush's fault, will the amendment, let's say Title 18, Section 2251 or 2516, will that be changed relating to mail fraud? That's my question.
Can either of you address that?
I don't think that statute is in play here. I think the only statute being changed is FISA and what is required in terms of warrants.
Jupiter, Florida, Republican line.
How do you do? A little nervous, first time calling in. But let me say, first of all, I respect the office of the presidency. I'm not interested in a coup or any stripping all the offices of their powers. But let me say this. No one is going to listen to my telephone call. No one is going to read my email or anyone that I know. But if we had been on top of this and we had listened to Muhammad Atta, then we would...
Oops, caller, sorry about that. That was my fault. College Station, Texas, you're next.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead.
Hello?
You're on the air, sir.
Am I on?
You know, we're going to put you on hold and move on to Chicago. Sorry about that. That was my fault. Chicago, you're on the air.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well, sir.
My question is this to both the gentlemen. I'm calling on my cell phone this morning, and with the wireless technology that we have, do I have any expectation of privacy? Because there could be a 16-year-old high school kid across the street from me monitoring my telephone calls, right now. So what expectation of privacy do I have in a wireless society? And I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Thank you.
Mr. Greenwald? I'm sorry, Mr. Riffkin.
Not much, and frankly, this is one of the things that puzzles me. We, as a price of living in a modern society, where you value the convenience of using a mobile phone, which can be easily intercepted without any warrant and not even by the government, where we submit reams of data to be able to get easy credit, where that data gets shared around. We somehow accept all of this, well, except for some people who really want to be, reclusive. But yet, when it comes to dealing with a government, our government, not a repressive government, the people we elect, somehow we use entirely different standards. We want to erect walls. And a caller a couple of calls ago was trying to make, I think, a very important point. We pay a huge price for erecting these barriers. There's a price I'm not saying that we shouldn't pay this price. Yes, there are checks and balances, Glenn, but don't you agree that for every check and balance, it doesn't come free? The government efficiency is reduced. It's more difficult. Do you remember the famous connecting the dots? It's more difficult to connect the dots. We have to understand that there's countervailing imperatives here that have to be balanced properly. It's not all, let's put as many restrictions on the government to the point it would be completely ineffectual.
And, I agree, and I began this discussion by making as explicitly clear as I could that everybody agrees that we want the government eavesdropping on terrorists. That is the premise of what we are doing. And then the question becomes what safeguards are necessary. The caller referred earlier to, if only we had been listening on Mohammed Atta prior to September 11. George Bush had the power and the authority to listen in on any suspected terrorist under the FISA law. We all want that, and he had that power. The fact that the government didn't listen in on Mohammed Atta is not because George Bush didn't have the power. He did. It's because he didn't exercise that power. And I agree, we need balance. And that is the law, that the balance is the balance that FISA struck, which is, yes, we want our government to be able to eavesdrop for proper purposes, But knowing that for decades that power has been abused, we will only allow our political leaders to listen in on us once they convince a judge in advance that we've actually done something wrong, or there's reason to think that we've done something wrong, and therefore we should have our conversations listening on. That is the process that this law eliminates.
10-second connection, very important. Glenn, it's not true. The 9/11 Commission makes it very clear that the FBI felt under the existing rules they could not search Muhammad out of computer. We had even an FBI whistleblower who came and testified, I forget her name.
Colin Rowley, and that's not true.
Well, again, there's reasonable belief that the government would not have, because the FISA court was very restrictive in how they approved applications.
They never reject any warrants. The FISA court is a rubber stamp court.
Forgive me, they reject plenty of warrants informally, and, well.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Here's an email question for both of you from Kathleen in Athens, Ohio. Does this recent expansion, she gives it to you first, but we'll let both of you answer it. Does this recent expansion of the FISA legislation retroactively exempt any of the allegedly illegal wiretapping that has already taken place during the last 6 years?
What the statute does is it says that the phone companies are required to comply with any orders the president gives to turn over data, although they have a process where they can object, and that if they comply with what the president orders in terms of giving our data or access, they cannot be sued. There will be no liability. What the law doesn't do is say that for everyone who has broken the law over the last 6 years, they will be immune, but the president said, and Mike McConnell has said, once Congress comes back from the recess, the first thing we want them to do is to give retroactive liability to all of the people in the phone companies and the telecom industries who have been breaking the law for the last 6 years. We want you to give them immunity, not only from being sued, but from being criminally prosecuted. That is next on their agenda. The president has said so. And what that would essentially mean is that not only the president, but also telecom companies who have been turning over our data illegally to the administration will have no accountability for breaking our laws. That is an extraordinarily dangerous step.
It is correct that, well, I agree that this legislation does not provide retroactive immunity. What I find utterly depressing is we have a situation, and by the way, you mentioned several times about 2 district court judges. We have an appellate court that threw out this lawsuit. We have depressing to me. I wrote about it several months ago in Wall Street Journal. Look at the situation we had in World War II, where the government, the industry came together to meet a common threat. What do we have now? You may hate George Bush. You may disagree with everything he's done. But surely you're not alleging that that phone companies, in complying with orders, administrative orders issued by the government the last several years, did anything willfully wrong, but they were interested in violating your privacy. They did what their government told them to do. You have people who sue those companies, who are trying to impede every ability of phone companies and every other company in America to cooperate with a government that is engaged in terrorism. It's despicable. To me, the fact that the government has to spend time and resources to go and try to add retroactive liability is depressing. We're absolutely distorting the incentive structure, where the CEO of a company several years from now would find it safer, Glenn, not to cooperate with a government and have another 9/11 occur and cooperate. That is, to me, absolutely sickening.
Let's get a couple more phone calls in here before we have to go. College Station, Texas. Good morning.
Good morning. Can I beg your indulgence to make a complicated point here?
Can you do it quickly, caller? We're running out of time.
Well, I've been waiting for a while. The man on the right has no veracity at all. Let's talk about what we know. We know that Alberto Gonzalez has hired people who were inferior, who were not the best qualified people. So they have perverted the civil service system. We should have the best people doing these jobs. If they contract jobs out like wiretapping, like they've done in Iraq to third parties, there's no way to supervise these people. There's no way to know what they do, who they wiretap on, and they don't keep records. So what the man on the right says is preposterous. He has no legitimacy. And just trust this stuff. Americans are smarter than that, and the majority of the American people know better, and we do not want to have this kind of fiasco with this wiretapping program that occurred in Iraq.
Okay, caller, we've already talked about those issues. Our last phone call, Bloomington, Illinois, Republican line.
Good morning. I have been listening with interest to Mr. Riffkin and Mr. Greenwald, and I have heard Mr. Riffkin speak on several prior occasions, and Mr. Greenwald on one or two as well, I believe. I've also read the scholarly articles authored and co-authored by Mr. Riffkin, several of them in recent months and in the last year or so, including the Wall Street Journal article to which he just alluded. I think the debate here this morning has been won hands down by Mr. Riffkin. He's been very specific. As a lawyer practicing almost 4 decades, I think he's very scholarly on the point, and he's accurate, and I think the mischaracterizations by Mr. Greenwald are typical of those of the Democratic Party and of the liberals concerning the provisions of the Patriot Act and of the Military Commissions Act of 2006.
Bloomington, let me ask you to get a little bit specific. What were some of the mischaracterizations so we can get a response?
In the Patriot Act?
No, by Mr. Greenwald.
With regard to the, he's painting with a broad brush his description of the provisions of this new law, which were passed by a Congress composed of Republicans as well as Democrats. It's unfortunate that it was extended for only 6 months rather than the 3 months that some of the Democrats wished it to be extended. It will be extended again, I'm confident, in 6 months. We'll go through the same debate again, and we'll get the same result. We have to have some protections for the citizens of the United States, and to try to extend all of those protections to foreigners who have no constitutional rights is folly.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the 6-month issue. 6 months from now, if they bring this back up, is it going to be more politically difficult for Democrats to not agree to give another 6 months or a permanent extension of this FISA law?
Well, I think it's interesting. Mr. Riffkin mentioned earlier, it's unfortunate that in 6 months we're going to have another debate. That was his verbatim quote. And I think it's incredibly important to point out that what happened here is Congress has been attempting to revise FISA to fix whatever problems there were, Democrats in Congress were, for several years. And the Bush administration was insisting, oh, no, we don't need any changes to FISA. We don't want any changes to FISA. Suddenly, weeks ago, they suddenly declared, oh, we need FISA revised dramatically within a matter of weeks. Otherwise, there'll be a terrorist attack, and it will be your fault. And the law that was passed in an extraordinary rush. No hearings were held. It's a complicated law. There's disagreement among good people in good faith about what the law even means. The people in Congress who just passed this law under a lot of pressure and all kinds of rhetoric from the administration have no idea what it is that they just enacted. And it's the only saving grace of this law is that now in a period of deliberation, we can have hearings and we can have a genuine debate about what kind of eavesdropping powers we want to vest in not just this president, but future presidents as well. That is the debate that we did not have because Congress, at George Bush's direction, passed this frenetically with barely an understanding of what they were doing.
Mr. Riffkin, a short response if you could.
Very short, several points. First of all, I really hope as we have another debate, we can get beyond any alleged sins by this administration. This administration is going to be in power for less than 2 years. We're supposed to look to the long term. So to me, everything about George Bush and Lambert Gonzalez is almost irrelevant. Point number one. Point number two, yes, there would be some reauthorization beyond 6 months. It would be very awkward for the Democrats in the absence of evidence that some horrible things have occurred during the next 6 months, and they won't, to say we were for it 6 months ago, but not anymore. And Glenn, I would welcome a debate. I wish we had a real, serious debate that would acknowledge there's a difference between American and foreigners, but the difference in this set of expectations of privacy and other expectations of privacy would acknowledge that I frankly have not heard you acknowledge that the proposition we all want to listen to terrorists is not entirely true. Yes, you want to listen to terrorists, but there's a price to be paid. The more restrictions you put on the government's ability to listen to terrorists, the less would be your intelligence take. That's the truth.
There should be no restrictions on the government's ability to listen in on terrorists, only to do so in secret. I think that's the point.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Glenn Greenwald, David Riffkin, good debate this morning. Thank you.